Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to our event this evening, Art, Memory and Place, the Role of Public Art in the Cemetery. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung and the Iluk Ut Willam Boon Wurrung of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight. I think that's quite poignant that we are meeting on land tonight that belongs to our Indigenous heritage, as cemeteries are all really about land. Subsequently, we'd like to pay our respects to their land, their ancestors and their elders, past, present and future. My name's Hamish Coates and I'm a landscape architect and artist, and currently I'm working with the Greater Metropolitan Cemeteries Trust based at Faulkner Memorial Park. My role there is to lead a team of designers and thinkers and that take care of the design and planning for the Trust's 600 hectares of public open space for future generations. So, judging by the interest in you all attending tonight, you're here because you also have an interest in, well, it's either art, it's cemeteries, or probably both, and you want to know a little bit more about what kinds of things we might talk about and how those two entities are put together. Or perhaps you're just plain curious and are keen to know more. Either way, we hope you're inspired to join in our conversation. The panel tonight comprises of like-minded people who more formally, through their respective practices, research and explore the notions that make up death and mortality and how we might deal with our end-of-life encounters. I'd like to introduce to my right Katrina Simon. Katrina's Associate Dean of Landscape Architecture at RMIT, who is interested in the expressions of memory in urban landscapes and what happens when those landscapes change through abandonment or disaster. To my left, I've got Dr. Amy Spears, an artist, writer and researcher whose interests lie in the questions around the gaps and silences in public discourse, where difficult histories and social issues are not confronted. To her left is Claire Martin, a landscape architect and Associate Director of Oculus, an international landscape architecture and research practice. Claire brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to the panel and will pose some questions about art's therapeutic qualities and how it might transition cemeteries through function and emotion. And lastly, we have Sam at the end there. Sam's an interdisciplinary artist and writer that is currently examining public participation in the reimagination of cemeteries as part of the Death Tech research team at the University of Melbourne. I myself will offer some insights and thoughts about the expectations of art in cemeteries and how an increasingly secular society offers more personal reflections on death and in lieu of favoured religious and iconographical art imagery. Each of us will outline our respective interests, invite you all to participate and respond with any questions, comments, opinions, stories, whatever you like really, to round out what we hope will be an inspired and insightful evening. With this in mind, I'd like to introduce Katrina.
Thank you, Hank. Thank you, Hamish, and it's great to see everybody. This is my first, I think, public speaking event participation in a year, so it's remarkable to be in a group again and getting used to what that means. So I love the furniture, and it makes me realise that most of the time I'm not 1.5 metres away from people, I'm a good deal closer. Anyway, I just want to give a brief overview of some of the ideas that I've been working with over a number of years about...
Can I just interrupt you, Katrina? Yep. I need a tech person to power up the laptop again.
So just talk amongst yourselves. Actually, I'll start. So the art of the cemetery, in the way that I conceptualise it, is not just in the artefacts built or planted to perpetuate memory, which might be tombstones, symbolic plants, but also in the aspects that relate to change and impermanence. So even landscapes built to perpetuate memory start to change and decay as soon as they're established. So many cemeteries thus demonstrate a tension between the desire for preservation of a particular view of the world and the place of humans within it, and these processes of transformation which challenge not just the physical fabric of the cemetery, but also the belief systems on and for which they were created. It's looking promising. So what might a cemetery designed in the early 21st century, can't read my own writing, tell the visitors of the future about how the people who designed and made it viewed their world? This is the time that we are now in. Thank you. So my interest in cemeteries emerged when I was studying landscape architecture and came across a cemetery in the city where I grew up, which was Christchurch, New Zealand. It was a Victorian cemetery, and I'd never paid it much attention, but drove through it frequently and ended up choosing it as a project for my final studies, and just became truly fascinated by how rich an environment it was, and also how people had very different ideas of what had happened to it, how it had been established. So I became really interested in how they can be read at multiple levels and scales, in their relationship to the city, in their layout, in the tombstones themselves, which are often the most recognisable feature, but also the specific symbolic vegetation and the vegetation that has grown itself, sometimes from berries dropped from wreaths, which I found a particularly poignant example. So after studying a research and design masters, I ended up working over a number of years doing design studios with friends and colleagues in Auckland and also in Sydney, and really curious about how, as a designer, we can engage not just with the recognisable artefacts and features, but more about the collective aspects that are somewhat unpredictable. Next. So part of my interest in the art of the cemetery is in its collective characteristics. It's really like a microcosm of the city in many ways, and it can also then reflect its changes in priority. The first image that you saw was one of Père Lachaise, a very famous cemetery in Paris, and it was the first time in the Western tradition that a cemetery was actually, you could buy a piece of land as a piece of property and own it in perpetuity. So this image is from Waikumete Cemetery in Auckland, and it is truly like a microcosm of the city, with a number of different areas that have evolved through time, but also the patina of the landscape itself changing as different areas have been left to more or less their own devices or cultivated in a way that doesn't really attempt to preserve their form as they were when they were initially established. Next. So while I was originally interested in my journey through the cemetery world on the appearance almost of ruins, so in this case from Barbados Street Cemetery, a broken tombstone, there were many of these. They were broken sometimes through ground changes, but others broken through vandalism. That rather than seeing them always as the sense of something that was deteriorating from a kind of ideal or perfect state, and a sense of loss themselves in terms of what they had come to represent, I became more interested in, starting from a focus on decay and ruination, I then became more interested in these processes of change themselves and how they, in their own way, actually were part of the sense of place of cemetery. The thesis that I wrote about this particular cemetery was called Landscape Change and the Becoming of Place. the significance of decay in the Barbados Street Cemetery. And this idea of place always becoming then started to become more of a preoccupation as I spent more time in different cemeteries around the world. Next. This is an image from a cemetery in Paris, designed around the same time as Père Lachaise, so in the early part of the 19th century, or the late part of the previous. And in this, I think there's this wonderful sense in which the grooves of the tombstone, which were written to tell a very specific story about very specific people at a very specific time, by their very physical characteristic, have started to become something else. That the grooves themselves create the conditions for a new kind of life to occur, in this case moss, and what was once a very specific, legible language becomes something else. And it starts to have its own agenda, really, and it starts to create a new landscape language. And this can also be seen at many scales of the cemetery. Next. Thank you. So this started to raise in me the interest in how this characteristic of cemeteries could actually be built into the very design of them. That they're not so much seen as segregated and somewhat static, but to actually celebrate this process of change and the way that they actually can be designed to accommodate and allow for a different kind of future as the cemetery itself, the organisms within it, actually start to take on their own characteristics. Next. This one in particular I love the previous image, almost looks like a photograph or an abstract of Central Park. I was in Paris at a time when the moss was at its height. I think there could be moss tours of Paris and cemeteries. But this really struck me as a wonderful opportunity to think about the characteristics of cemeteries, not simply as a loss of something that is finite or recognisable, but as actually in itself a characteristic of this kind of landscape of evolving memory and change. And this image I found particularly poignant. It's basically a very simple wall designed as a columbarium wall, and in these tiny spaces, which are really awaiting an urn and a plaque to go across the top, these tiny gardens have manifested themselves. And so I take these as a sign of hope and a sign of the future possibility of a landscape of continually evolving memory. Thank you. So I'd now like to hand over to Hamish, who's going to speak about his own interests in art and cemeteries.
Thanks, Katrina. Yeah, give it up for Katrina. Cemeteries are an interesting idea. I haven't always worked in cemeteries. I've only been really involved with them for the last 5 years in a big time. A few years prior to that, just kind of fell into it really, and no pun intended. But they've presented quite a unique challenge and quite an insightful and gift that keeps on giving over and over again, largely because as a landscape architect, they offer every kind of typology and cultural expectation that I've ever really encountered. One of our closing remarks at a meeting, if it's not going very well, is, well, we'll all see you at some stage. And it's true of everybody and every culture. This is a plan of GMCT where I work. This is the spread of cemeteries. This represents the 600 hectares, two sites of which are greenfield sites. The reputation of cemeteries is something that I've realised is quite different too. They're often described as kind of gothic horror places, made famous by Hollywood generally, and by default, places where ghosts and zombies reside. Well, we know that's just not true. But despite that, their image is dark and it's hidden and enclosed by high walls or fences and tall iron gates. And this kind of image is born from the old church burial yard and later the crumbling and neglected monuments of Victorian cemeteries. And death is historically and culturally connected to religion, its beliefs and value systems, and the myriad interpretations of salvation and the delivery of the soul to the afterlife. As such, the proliferation of art in cemeteries takes the form of stone sculptures, often figurative and symbolic motives that adorn and characterise the grave site. So it's something we've come to expect. Our expectation of art in cemeteries is directly concerned with the traditional forms of figuration and the ancient cultural symbology that acknowledges a religion as the main influence of the life led. The angel, in all its guises, symbolises a certain form of salvation underpinned by hope of the soul being delivered from this world to the next. The default to religious iconography in cemeteries and grave sites. I think I've gone a bit far there. No, got that wrong. Where am I? The default to religious iconography in cemeteries and grave sites portrays an individual living in a society that, despite the life led, provides an expectation of redemption and or salvation for right or wrong and for better or worse. The image of the cemetery is underpinned by the similarity of grave monuments, a certain product that demonstrates wealth and status to the living and perhaps motivated by the expectations of being delivered to a better place, whatever that might be. Similarly, the making of art is reduced from a labour of love through the chiselling of stone to selecting a figure whose pose is struck from a mould. It's like a cookie cutter type experience, a certain expectation that if we were to follow that form, then all is well. The rise of an increasingly secular society is pushing the collective nature of religion to one side as its limitations and unanswerable questions and impossibilities makes way for a more personal interpretation and understanding of death, memorialised in a more meaningful and introspective way. Sorry about that. A self-described spiritualism sees a celebration of life depicted in a variety of personal choices, decorated and compostable coffins, and I had that picture back there. You may have all experienced that at some stage yourselves. And cross-cultural appropriation of customs and traditions, and or a reversion to the beauty of nature and landscape as the dominant and guiding force in one's life. The expectation of a certain art in cemeteries, while alive and well, is no longer the default choice to memorialise one's life. The recognition of the wider non-religious world and the world we choose to inhabit is a valid perception of redemption and resolution, nonetheless, that honours a person's life and is memorialised accordingly. So they're just a few observations really that I've made after working in cemeteries for about 5 years. It's fascinating, but thank you very much for that. And I think now Amy has got some things to say. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, so my name's Amy Spears. I work at RMIT and Monash University. I work at a bunch of places, but I'm not an expert on cemeteries. And when I got the invitation to talk here, I was like, oh, okay, this is a little bit tangential to my research, but I think I can do this. And it's been a quite nice way to reflect on I guess, my own obsessions with contemporary public art, but also around memorials and monuments and counter-monuments and how people might I suppose the images I'm going to show you are of artworks that are trying to one, present kind of loss in this kind of effective way, but often around losses that may have been ignored or overlooked. So I'll take you through a little story of how I came to be interested in monuments, and then perhaps tangentially you might see how a public art of a future cemetery that I guess acknowledges the diversity of communities might somehow be amongst these sorts of artistic proposals, I suppose. So this first image is of the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. It's by architect Peter Eisenman, and it was opened in 2005. And the only reason why I'm showing you this is, it's a semi-famous memorial to the Holocaust, but it also is the competition that surrounded this monument, and Peter Eisenman ended up being the winner, but the competition I find really interesting. And it actually prompted a lot of artists in Germany to think about what they actually thought might be unrepresentable, which is the huge amounts of loss of lives during the Nazi times. So Eisenman's sculpture is made of 30,000 sort of pillars or stelae, and it's in Berlin. You may have been there, but it's in varying heights, and you kind of get a bit disoriented in the sculpture. And it can be quite moving, being in the middle and sort of maybe losing your friends. And I suppose that disorientation was supposed to I guess represent what does it say? It says here how reference the disorientation felt by Europe's hunted Jewish population. But the monument itself often gets criticised because it's now people take selfies there, and it's iconic of being in Berlin, and people have picnics on the top of the pillars, and apparently it was a gay beat for a while there. But I quietly think that tension is sort of interesting. Life goes on, but I think it gives sort of, I don't know, some sort of contemporary slant to the monument itself. But to give you some background, I went to Berlin a few years ago because I was interested in the fact that I guess all these conversations around how to represent a difficult history in Germany's time of the Jewish Holocaust, but thinking about the fact that we have our own history of genocide in Australia, but we don't represent it very often in memorials, and that is frontier violence, frontier wars that decimated the Indigenous population in Australia and had huge effects on culture. So if you can go to the next slide. While I was in Berlin doing this research and just looking at how artists have tried to display, I guess, genocide and loss, I found out about this really amazing proposal by Horst Heissel, and it was for the site of the Peter Eisenman artwork. But basically what he proposes in this work is, instead of making another monument, he's we don't need another monument. In order to commemorate a destroyed people, we need a destroyed monument. So he proposed to blow up the Brandenburg Gate, which is a symbol of Berlin, as a way of expressing the loss, the huge amount of loss that happened during the Holocaust, which I kind of love. I love kind of conceptual, sort of bold, kind of provocative proposals. And of course, it never won, obviously, and I think that was kind of the point, that we would never actually go so far to do something as intense as blowing up something. But I guess I was struck by Horst Heissel's efforts to represent the scale of loss. If you want to go to the next slide. Horst Heissel is also very famous for actually realising some monuments. And this one he did with Andreas Nitz, and it's at the Birkenwald concentration camp. But it's basically a steel plate with the names of all the different nationalities that were killed in that concentration camp. But the plate is warmed to the body temperature of a human body. So I think it's 37 degrees all night, all day, all summer, all winter. And it's particularly poignant in winter when the snow doesn't land, it melts as it hits it, and apparently people go to touch it. So, I mean, you can see, like, I'm sort of interested in these more conceptual monuments, and I find this sort of quite moving and interesting, the efforts that have been put into sort of thinking about how to represent, huge amounts of loss. And I think Heiselberg says here, instead of repairing the irreparable, the goal of these sorts of monuments is to make the absence of murdered people visible and felt. And I think it's this kind of, how do you make it felt? So anyway, go to the next slide. When I was thinking about Heiselberg's proposal of blowing the Brandenburg Gates, I came back to Australia, and with my collaborator Catherine Ryan in 2013, we made a lookout on Cockatoo Island. Cockatoo Island's in the middle of Sydney Harbour. And that lookout looked over Sydney Harbour. Okay, cool. I just realised I put the wrong slide in, but that's okay. So anyway, this is the lookout. And people would walk up to it, and the work's called Nothing to See Here, Removal of Sydney Harbour Bridge. And you would walk up to the lookout, and you'd look through these goggles, and you could see the entire harbour through the goggles, except for the harbour bridge. And it was done through an augmented reality app. And what was funny is a lot of people didn't notice the bridge was gone, which I thought was interesting, because the work was at once sort of trying to talk about, say, Indigenous losses, but at the same time, like via Horst Heisel's proposal, but at the same time also talking about denial and effacement of those losses. So the actual harbour bridge was actually just sort of smeared out with the augmented reality app, so it was kind of interesting. It was sort of more like a shitty removal, but I kind of liked it. It's like our shitty ways of like effacing frontier violence in those histories was sort of the commentary. And I've got books about that artwork. We made so many that even in 2021, I still have a ton of them, so feel free to take them. Anyway, so to keep going, so my research kind of went on to become interested in how artists might counter racist colonial histories in Australia. And just as an aside, we're doing a symposium with ACCA starting from tomorrow called Counter Monuments, if you're interested in that kind of thing. There's a bunch of us talking about this subject matter. But I'm not sure if you guys know this monument. It's probably one of the first or few monuments to frontier violence in Victoria. It's near RMIT on Franklin Street, but it's basically a commemoration of Tinnamunnawaits and Moibahina, two Tasmanian Aboriginal men who were the first men to be hung in Victoria in 1842. And they were basically killed for spearing a whaler, I believe, but the idea is that from our contemporary perspective, they're actually freedom fighters fighting for the freedom of Indigenous people, and their punishment under the colonial law is seen as problematic, I suppose, because they were fighting for their land. The kind of monument itself is supposed to look at first like a swing set. And a lot of contemporary artists like doing this. They kind of disarm you. I was like, oh, it's a swing set. And then we walk up and you realise it's actually a gallows. And there's all this information telling you about this kind of work. So, there's a counter monument for you. And then the next one, I quite like this one, seeing as we're talking about cemeteries, yeah. You might have seen this as a part of the Sydney Biennale. It's Alaskan artist Nicholas Galligan. He basically excavated the shadow of a Cook monument and suggesting the burial of the Cook monument itself, but also along with the burial of destructive governance and treatment of Indigenous land, Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous knowledge. Art in cemeteries could be like this, perhaps. The next one. And then also thinking about different kinds of memorial practices. This is beautiful work by Marie Clark, who's an Indigenous woman based in Victoria, and she talks about, she's been making these copies in workshops, so non-Indigenous, Indigenous people together sharing in Victorian Indigenous memorial practices, and the kopje is made of gypsum and like emu sinew, but it can be up to 7 kilos. And you wear that for anywhere between weeks and months. while you're mourning the dead, depending on how close you were to the deceased, and then eventually you take it off. So it's this memorial practice that's being recovered by Indigenous people in Victoria. Mostly women did it, but apparently some men. So anyway, I really like public art that's not just sculptures. It might come across. I think kind of more performative things are sort of interesting. So I don't know how long I've been talking for. Keep going. Okay. So on the subject of counts monuments, we'll go on the next one. I'm really interested in the way that sort of monuments are being defaced and removed and reconfigured at the moment, particularly in a way of contesting racist histories. And this is one of the more beautiful images of recent past. This is during the Black Lives Matter movements. This is a Confederate statue. What is it? It's a General Robert E. Lee statue from Richmond, Virginia in the US. And it's photographed in June 2020. But basically you've got, you can just see the kind of signs of like lots of graffiti on the bottom. And then on this evening they projected the face of George Floyd, who was killed by policemen last year. So this racist Confederate monument became the site of Black Lives Matter counter-histories. And so you had things like this projection, the vandalism, that's not called vandalism, lovely graffiti, and then sort of libraries springing up and public talks all around this site. So I'm really interested in the way that monuments become sites for alternative histories. Do you want to go to the next one? And speaking of trying to talk about scale of loss, this work is called In America, How Could This Happen? By an artist named Susan Brennan Fistenberg. It was made in 2020, and she's basically trying to represent the huge amounts of loss of Americans to COVID. And I think so far she's got 220,000 flags. They're just little flags which she's been putting up. But it's like the loss has become this performative thing where it's outstripping her capacity to put the flags in. So, yeah. Anyway, next one. This is also a beautiful work. It's built Jill Majid. It's called Tender. And Tender comprises of 120,000 pennies, the amounts of a Trump-endorsed stimulus check, whose edges are engraved with the slogan, "The body was already so fragile." The title and the message suggest a convergence of money, legal tender, and physical vulnerability, economy and care. And basically they're distributed through bodegas in New York. The bodegas were one of the few things that stayed open during New York lockdowns. You can buy things with small change, like gum and cigarettes, but they're often owned by immigrants, and black people were some of the people most affected by COVID in the States. So anyway, Jill Majid sees this as a sort of memorial of sorts. And I love this kind of work. Like, it's so invisible. It's like probably someone will get that penny and not even notice that they've got an artwork in their hand. But the idea of it perpetuates in this beautiful way. Yeah, so I really like subtle works like that. And then I'm just going to finalise. I mean, you can't talk about artworks about loss without talking about Felix Gonzalez Torres' works. He made some really beautiful poetic works in the early 90s around the AIDS crisis. This artwork is basically a picture of his bed, but it's got the impression of two heads there. And it was made in 1991, and it was put on billboards all over New York. And it's such a beautiful kind of meditative image. I mean, you're basically talking about homosexuality here, stuff that was still sort of problematic to talk in public at that time. But also the main thing to remember is that his partner died of AIDS, Ross, in 1991. So it's got this very poignant sense of like absence, presence going on. And then I just love Felix, so I just chucked this one in as well. This work's called Perfect Lovers, and it's basically two clocks that were probably at the right time when they were first installed, but as time goes on, they slowly go out of sync. But if you ever want to look at someone who makes really beautiful conceptual works about, I guess, lives, lost lives, he's one to look at. I hope that was useful and interesting. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Hamish and Amy. And in our schedule, which is somewhat elastic, we have just thought it would be interesting just for the panel perhaps just to pose a few observations or questions to each other. We'll have time for questions from the floor shortly, but first I'd just like to see if either Sam or Claire, I see Claire's been taking notes, have any observations or questions?
Yeah, I think, well, I guess probably one for you, Katrina, and for Hamish is, I guess you, Katrina, talked about symbolism and Hamish, you talked about religion. And so I think in the context of what Amy's just presented, I was kind of interested in how relevant you think both symbolism and religion remain in the context of 21st century cemeteries.
Thank you for that excellent question, Claire. So I guess the thing that I am particularly interested in is the ways in which the materiality of the cemetery and the processes that go on because of natural processes, because of water, soil, decomposition, that those things themselves can augment any traditional or more, I guess, somewhat formalised forms of symbolism. And that to me they are in many ways a very rich area that does make it more possible for cemeteries to retain their relevance, even if sort of beyond perhaps a more recognisable symbolic religious symbolism. So to me, this idea that there is symbolism inherent in those processes and that can actually be activated or made more present in the cemetery, then, yeah, I think expands that repertoire without relying on a particular iconography.
And I think that my observations are really just a response to the sheer weight of imagery that I deal with on a daily basis. It's I work at Fawkner Cemetery, which is a historic cemetery, and I'm struck by the continuity of the imagery throughout the cemetery. I like to think that we deal with all cultures and all kinds, but really it's dominated by a certain origin, I guess, and that is defined by a life led with religion front and centre of people's lives. And so it was an expectation in my mind that this is the way that you define your life and how you live your life. Those values and beliefs and those institutions, or the institution of religion, has declined, I think, somewhat, but there is still quite a strong and prevalent preference for that. And I think that it goes through a certain time of your life as well. I think that if you're born into a family that is quite religious, goes to church on Sundays and the like, then as you grow, you kind of leave that and find your own life. But I think when push comes to shove and you're faced with death, then religion becomes something that you can fall back on quite easily. And it does explain the unexplainable, or provides sort of comfort and relief when you don't know what's going to happen once that clock stops ticking. And when I was younger, you travel through life saying, I'm not afraid of death, but I think that's because no one had as a young age, generally you're not confronted by death. And I think that once you are, then you certainly change your attitudes about your own beliefs, your fears and your convictions by the same token. But I'm lucky because I've got the freedom of choice, but I think in some more perhaps ancient cultures or earlier cultures, let's say, and earlier times, from how you were brought up, there was really no such choice, or the choice was more limited, or you had to fight to have that choice. So I think that's where this kind of cookie cutter type salvation that I observe comes into things. And so as I mentioned before, the craft of art is replaced by moulds and a number of choices that you can adorn your grave with, and that's like ticking the box and saying, well, right, I'm going in the right direction when I die. I'm going up and not down. So I think that sort of reduces your beliefs a little bit. And as we've discussed, the first three of us, it shows a progression from the monument to other forms of representation and memorialisation.
Thanks. So I'm just going to dive in again for one more question because it kind of relates to what you were saying, and it's sort of for Amy. So I guess in terms of, I was just thinking you spoke quite a lot about absence, which obviously in the counter-monument kind of tradition makes sense, but also the notion of removal and denial. So I just wondered if you wanted to talk to a trend in Australian cemetery context of the notion of perpetuity no longer being a given. So the idea that you may be reinterred or you may be ultimately not just absent but removed. And I just thought if you might want to talk to that.
Yeah, okay. I guess maybe one of the things is some of those images talking to the idea that some bodies are not as valued as other bodies, or some deaths or whatever. And so this idea, perhaps when you're privileged and white, you think that there's some sort of justice where your body will always be sacred and in the ground. And perhaps this idea of perpetuity or not being able to have that maybe decouples our sense of justice or something about how we're treated when we're dead. And I don't know, my only thought is that might help people have a sense of empathy or understanding of what it's like when Indigenous bodies are still not being properly commemorated. It's the only thing that comes to the top of my mind. But yeah, I just think that we can be so precious about our own losses, particularly in white colonial Australia. I did a lot of research around Anzac memorials and the numbers of those in every town, or memorials to lost white children or whatever, but there are no memorials to stolen children or whatever. And I think, if we're going to talk about wanting our bodies to be taken care of, we should think about the bodies that have come before us. Anyway.
Perhaps just one comment as well. I think the very notion of perpetuity somehow gives the impression that it's always been like that, and it hasn't. So I think that's another characteristic. It is a, relatively speaking, there are certain monuments that have been incredibly ancient, but it's also, in terms of cemetery design, a relatively recent characteristic which we now think is a given and is being challenged again. I think we'll move on to our second bracket. So I'd like to invite Claire to speak about 7 things.
Thanks, Katrina. So, as Hamish said, my name is Claire Martin, and I work with Oculus Landscape Architecture and Urban Design, and I'm also the National President of the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects. So my fascination with cemeteries came about through the convergence at university of an interest in the postmodern sublime, but also in the death of someone close to me. And Oculus is presently fortunate to be working on a number of projects for the Greater Metropolitan Cemetery Trust. So I'll be directly referencing Alain de Botton and John Armstrong's ideas of art as therapy and the 7 functions of art to assert the value of public art in cemeteries in the context of the climate and biodiversity emergency. So I'm starting from the premise that both cemeteries and humans are ecological, and for the purposes of today's conversation, that we might understand cemeteries as transects between life and death, nature and culture, profoundly capable of thwarting the fixity of identity. And so this is actually the only image of a cemetery that I will show. Public cemeteries are invaluable pieces of social, cultural, ecological and economic infrastructure with the capacity to help us to mitigate and adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change. Remembering. When people die, they leave holes. The process of remembering is an embodied struggle to hold on to things and people we love when they are gone. But I think Botton and Armstrong would argue that it's more a case of what are we trying to remember. And I would argue why we often wait until it is lost to ascribe that value that is actually the key argument. So the role of art in the cemetery might be considered to be preserving experience. It transports from the everyday, and it helps to place us in a wider context. For them, art would help us to edit down complexity. It enables us to focus on the meaningful. Hope. We feel small and weak in the face of existential threats. Morbidity reminds us of the inevitability of our own mortality, and extreme weather events remind us of the existential threat of climate change. So for them, the important ingredient of art might be considered optimism, and that is essential for the success of hope. If being realistic is an antidote to idealization, then we might argue that design and art are tools to preserve hope. They enable us to distill and to concentrate the hope that we might all need to chart a path forward. Sorrow. If art is to be considered therapy, then for Bottin and Armstrong, it must teach us how to suffer more successfully. Sorrow for them is undoubtedly a universal feature of life, but critically, it is about the idea that sad things seem worse when we feel that we are suffering them alone. Therefore, both public art and cemeteries have a pivotal role to play through the social and collective expression. They equip us to deal with very particular grief. Thanks. Rebalancing. Art can help to restore a measure of equilibrium, helping to return us to the missing portions of our characters. For de Bottin and Armstrong assert that our aesthetic tastes differ because we are all not all missing the same things. So the presence of cemeteries, absence, can create viable meaning. Meaning for them, in turn, rebalances by encouraging us to be the very best versions of ourselves. Self-understanding. We are not transparent to ourselves, they argue. Art latches onto something that we have felt but never clearly seen. Both people and objects have identity and qualities of character. And in the context of cemeteries, art, therefore, might be a media through which we can come to better know ourselves. Growth. Growth is about overcoming defensiveness, they state. To grow and evolve, we must look for points of connection. The mindset of the designer or the artist, therefore, briefly overlaps with our own values and experiences. For de Bottin and Armstrong, growth occurs when we discover how to remain authentically ourselves in the presence of potentially threatening things. Appreciation. We find it hard to take note of what is always around. Art can lead us back to more accurate appraisal of what is valuable, they suggest. The power of art is to honour that elusive but real value of ordinary life. For de Bottin and Armstrong, art can reawaken us to the genuine merit of life as we are forced to lead it. If we are desensitised to death by the familiarity of the everyday, then art is our resensitisation tool.
Thank you, Claire.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sam Holleran, and I'm a member of the Death Tech research team at the University of Melbourne. My focus is on how cemeteries are used as civic spaces. And I guess I came to cemeteries a bit as some people here in the sort of realm of landscape architecture and park design. As you can hear, I'm not from here. I'm originally from New York City, where I've spent most of my adult life, and I did a lot of participatory design projects related to urban parks. This is Prospect Park right here. And as I dug a little bit deeper and looked at the kind of creation of green space in New York City, I realized that cemeteries were in fact the very first green spaces that New York City had. So they predate the creation of parks in the 19th century by several decades, and were really used as public parks for a long time. So this is Prospect Park. Next slide, please. But actually, about 20 years before Prospect Park was created by Olmsted, Greenwood Cemetery was laid out with the same kind of meandering path design that would become the signature of these mid-19th century grand public parks. And Greenwood Cemetery was, in fact, used very much as a park space. There was a lot of people who were coming there on the newly established omnibus lines to picnic, to visit the dead, to observe the memorials, because this is also before the origin of museums in New York. There were no museums like the Metropolitan, these kind of very well-known museums today didn't exist. So the public statuary in cemeteries was really helping people, or people were absorbing it as a form of art that they could see and they could visit on a kind of basis that was unconfined by money or time. It also got to be a little bit too popular. There was a lot of stories about young couples frolicking amongst the graves and the problems this presented. So one of the reasons why park design sort of supplanted cemeteries is because they wanted to differentiate the uses of parks and cemeteries. Next one. But by the mid-20th century, you get a lot of urban growth, and these cemeteries that were formerly peripheral on the edge of the city have been very much subsumed by the city itself. This is a cartoon from the New Yorker from the early 1950s that shows a cemetery in Connecticut that was entirely surrounded by a golf course. So there was really like a couple graves left by the sand pit, and people would sort of go in there and ponder their mortality as they fetched their balls. This is something that's also kind of replaying itself in Western Sydney right now, as there's a controversy over turning an aging golf course into a cemetery that's generating a lot of controversy. Next slide, please. Sorry. There's also, as cities grow, the housing and other things are starting to kind of creep up on cemeteries. And people are also starting to appreciate cemeteries as a park space, so a quiet space. If your house fronts onto a cemetery, for many that might be a really negative thing. It might, they could see it as something that would adversely affect the resale price of their home. But also people think of it as a contemplative space, a space for bird watching and natural life in the city. This is in Dublin, where a new housing development has kind of surrounded a cemetery in a U-like shape. Next one. This is here in Melbourne, the Footscray Cemetery, which serves as a sort of buffer between a residential neighborhood and the light industrial shipping quarter that's next door. And next one, please. And in Heidelberg Cemetery, where the kind of civic life of the neighborhood really abuts the cemetery in a kind of dramatic way. Next one. And this is in Oakley, where cemetery is actually turned over to the local council and is kind of amidst park space, used very often as a cut-through for people who are kind of passing from the fields to the town center and shops. And in that sense, juxtaposing the everyday life of people with prams and kids playing with these very, very old gravestones. Next one. So I'm really interested in how people enjoy and appreciate cemeteries. I studied design, so I actually came to cemeteries very much looking at the typography and these weird esoteric typefaces that were developed by stone carvers in the 19th century, the meanings of them, and the kind of interesting little flourishes that people put on relatively regimented forms of memorialization. Often they were given templates from stone carvers, but also chose to do different and weird things with their memorials for loved ones. These kind of serendipitous moments of art in cemeteries. This is in Basel in Switzerland, where a number of the graves have stained glass kind of incorporated into them. And I just found this very poignant, this kind of fall landscape at sunset and the stained glass there. I also think it's a kind of testament to the safety and stewardship of the community that glass remains in place, because it's old and it's glass. And cemeteries are also places that have often experienced vandalism, unfortunately. More and more, there's a kind of impetus to put art projects in cemeteries. This is a dance performance in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, hosted by Creative Time, one of the big nonprofits commissioning public art in New York City. And they've actually also established a art residency in Greenwood Cemetery where artists can apply to spend a year, I think, working out of one of the outbuildings there, but creating a site-specific work that addresses the cemetery, something that's become even more necessary in the pandemic when traditional art viewing spaces like galleries and theaters were closed down. Next one. And this is a piece by Sophie Calais that I really liked, also in Greenwood Cemetery, also commissioned by Creative Time, where she made this kind of, ersatz stele to put your secrets in, the idea that you could kind of write down a secret and then stuff it into this monument that would stay there, not in perpetuity, but for a couple of years. And then the cemetery has also been a place for other arts, for performing arts, for theater, for musical performances. And of course, that pushes the boundaries for what we think is an acceptable balance between memorialization and the respect that we ought to have for those who've come before us and those who are interred permanently in the cemetery, and the civic life of people who live nearby. So what is the appropriate, is it okay to watch Shakespeare in a cemetery, but would it be wrong to watch hair in a cemetery? Or what's the kind of cultural boundary that we're talking about here? And with that, I guess I'll leave it and we can open it up.
Thank you, Claire and Sam. And perhaps just to begin with, just see if either Amy or Hamish have a question they'd like to raise or pose from that.
Yeah, I was just thinking about your last point about revelry in the cemetery, and I was thinking again about how the objections to the memorial to the murdered Jews is a bit like that, like people shouldn't enjoy themselves around it. Do you have any strong opinions about this?
I have lots. So I think it's really interesting because I also used to live in Berlin, so the memorial occupies an interesting space where it's very much in the center of the city, and there's not a great demarcation between the civic life and that memorial. So in some ways I can't blame people because there's actually no kind of liminal moment where you pass from the city into that space and it says, hey, this is a memorial. And I think other memorials like Maya Lin's Vietnam War Memorial do a bit of there's a kind of space that you pass through, like a grassy field, that gets you ready for the thing that you're about to experience there, and knowing that this is going to be a somber thing. I think there's also a really interesting thing about when these memorials occur in cemeteries, like the power of a memorial like Eisenman's to the murdered Jews of Europe, which exists right next to the Brandenburg Tor, right next to the heart of civic and social power in Berlin, and then memorials that are kind of off in the cemetery. And sometimes you even see memorials that actually existed in the city that were brought to the cemetery as a kind of storehousing. These sort of lower rung war memorials in the US are often kind of brought out to the cemetery so they'll stop occupying valuable real estate in these intersections. That to me is very fascinating.
I guess this is to you, Claire, I guess in the first instance, although Sam, I'm sure you've got some thoughts as well, but this reconciliation between art and cemeteries is another kind of boundary. We know the histories and the association, it's been there forever, but there's a new reconciliation in my mind anyway between the old and the new. I think what we've talked about here tonight is that transition between the old and the new, from something quite traditional and expected and reverential now to personal meaning and introspection, as I mentioned before. But that's also aligned with some of the former uses of the cemetery which possibly need to come back again. Do they need to come back again? Those recreational uses and...
Oh, sorry, is that for me? Yeah, I mean, I certainly think, and clearly it's sort of in line with your strategic priorities, I think, in terms of understanding how to reposition the cemetery back in what was a 19th century tradition of being accessible to the public. I think it's just, yeah, it is interesting in terms of those protocols and at what, you know, what sort of behaviours, which again are probably consistent with the way that those parks were regulated in the 19th century. So it may be that there aren't fences, but there will still be certain expected behaviour. And I think that that's quite an interesting challenge, is how do we understand the value of cemeteries socially, culturally, environmentally, still have them respected as places for people to express collective grief in a respectful way. So I think that, yeah, those sorts of behaviours and what sort of mnemonic devices we use in the design of cemeteries become really interesting or really challenging. And then I guess that's where I think the notion of type is interesting as well. And obviously that depends on its site context culturally and, again, environmentally. So, yeah.
And no doubt art in all its many forms can help facilitate those new ideas as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that, to go back to Katrina's thing, obviously art, you know, is still evident in the monumentality of cemeteries, and clearly within the offer that GMCT have at all of their cemeteries. So I think that and there are certain trends, and there are obviously certain trends that are culturally specific. So I think that the way that art might be reconceived and the notion of permanence as well will definitely need to play out. And I think certainly in the context of environmental art, I think that will obviously continue to play out.
Certainly in the time that I've been looking into this area, and possibly the same for all of you in different ways, I think the kinds of responses that people more generally make if you say you're interested in cemeteries, that's really changed quite dramatically, I would say, in the last 25 years. I think there's much more an awareness of change process, transience and impermanence. I think that's really become very much more of a conversation. And it's not simply a reaction to physical deterioration. It seems to be other values that are put on those kinds of... Sorry, I'm not very good with the microphone. I like the ones that you stick on your head. They're easier. I'm just really aware of there may be people in our wonderful audience who have questions, and I believe there are microphones roaming. Does anyone have a question or a comment, preferably a question, that they'd like to throw to anyone on the panel, or to more than one? Yep, we've got somebody at the back there, thank you. Yep.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm very interested in the role of plants in cemeteries, and I was wondering if anyone had any particular comments about plants as an artistic medium. I'm thinking of avenues of honour and that sort of thing, but I'm wondering what's going on sort of in the modern sphere.
Yeah, I mean, I've also got an interest in Avenue of Honour, the Avenues of Honour, and I think one of the slides that I showed is actually an Oculus project for Remember and Strive Interchange, which was instrumental in reuniting the two sides of the longest Avenue of Honour in the Southern Hemisphere. So I think it would probably be good for the federal government to divert money from the War Memorial to actually going around the country and reinstating a number of those avenues of honour, but that is not an official position. So yeah, I think in terms of planting, the projects that we're involved in with GMCT are actually looking at utilisation of a woody meadow strategy. So I think that is not so much about art as much as it is about understanding, I guess, the amenity and aesthetic value of planting and how that can become artful in its composition. And I think also, I guess, in the context of dwindling municipal budgets and the failings of landscape maintenance, the strategy of the woody meadow becomes quite an interesting strategy in terms of being high amenity, high biodiversity value, and lower maintenance. So I think I would say that we haven't yet explored planting specifically in an artful way, but I think we are looking at it with a very particular aesthetic dimension, and I think that aesthetic dimension is the more than human in terms of what it can do for the environment that it's sitting in, and so I think that can be another reading that could do many of the things that I was alluding to, I suppose, in terms of having an art-like value, if that answers that question vaguely.
I'm going to add to that. The big challenge in cemeteries at the moment is that cemeteries are really heavily contested spaces between burial ground and the landscape, I'd say. We're lucky to have Fawkner Memorial Park, which is a very old and historic cemetery with a mature landscape, so it's a great demonstration of what a cemetery can be. But I can tell you I've had lots of arguments with certain people to say, well, we should keep trees and not turn them over for burial space. And of course, being a self-funded organisation, that's just like saying we're not going to sell products and improve our bottom line. But I sort of counter-argue by saying it's in perpetuity. So I always win. And, well, I like to think so. But the other aspect when we do talk about plants and planting is that the type of plant is another kind of contested and argumentative form. Roses, for example, are fairly high maintenance, but everybody likes a rose bush and that's what they want to see in cemeteries. And like I was alluding to in my talks, that's what people feel comforted by, that's what they kind of expect, and that's to some degree served up. But our team at GMCT is working very hard to offer alternatives and promote the value of plants and spaces in line with people like Claire, and try and turn over the fact that we can do things in a different way. Once we get to that point, we'll start doing it probably in an artistic fashion.
Does anyone else have a question they'd like to raise? I see a hand. Yes, I've got a hand. Can't hear you. Sorry, the microphone's just coming. Yeah.
Hello. From my perspective, I want to know that, like for now, commemoration of beloved ones are kind of restricted in the boundary of cemeteries and perhaps like personal homes. I wonder, have we sort of like taken this commemoration into public space? So like, for example, this imagery has shown like how recreational activities are integrated into cemeteries, but then it's not really commemoration. So that's sort of like rituals and like activities more related to commemorating the deaths of beloved ones or others. Can that be like a derivation of cemetery, like a new, like modern space that like remembering anyone? Yeah.
It just comes to mind that what would have been nice to have on this panel actually is Lara Toms, who did a show called The Director, and she's a theatre maker. So I have no like massive personal experience of death, and but Lara does. I mean, both her parents have died at different circumstances, but she basically worked with a funeral director from Tasmania who's got some unusual ideas about the way cemeteries and funerals should be run. But they basically, through this theatre show, propose a kind of more queer, more exciting, more performative way of commemorating the dead through funerals and cemeteries. Anyway, it just makes me think that there are probably lots of... I mean, the thought of cemeteries kind of deadens me, pun intended. You know, I just feel like there's much more creative ways, which I'm not sure if it's a response to what you're saying, but I just think there's other ways to think about death, and we're quite stuck in some regards.
I think it's quite interesting that when I came across Burning Man, how like I realized it was like in commemoration of a friend of the people who's running it like have deceased, so that is kind of like set up for the commemoration of this particular guy, but then like is joined by others, so it becomes like a collective commemoration. Yeah, it's just beautiful.
Yeah, I think that was basically the idea of Lara's show as well, was this idea that both her parents died and they were experimental artists and very interesting people, and just the options she was offered when they died was just like not adequate. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I kind of feel like symmetry, like people's this like grave can't really expressing symmetry, or it can't like satisfy people's needs of this expressing grave of others and memory is not enough for like a modern day public space. Yeah.
I think some of the examples of memorials that are sometimes temporary and can be more provocative because they aren't perhaps tied to some of the legal requirements to do with disposal of the dead, also offer ways that a number of people are exploring in various places about challenging this assumption that cemeteries are separate and are bounded. And I think even the photographs at the end that Sam showed, the sort of juxtaposition of images and uses, I think are becoming much more, there's an openness to those. So I think it's really an area that is becoming more, more elastic in some ways.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that as well, there's a really good book by someone whose name I cannot remember called Funeral Rights, and I think it talks a lot about changing conventions in relation to the legality around what you can do with bodies and death. But I was just thinking there are lots of trends within healthcare where people will, the idea of the hospital without walls and actually being treated in the home. So I think the approach to healthcare might actually start to re-engage people with the body physically and outside of, because there is just a medicalisation of death, in particular in Australia. And so I think that sort of deinstitutionalising hospital, which I think could be good and can be also very bad, I think, might also start to change our relationship to death, I suspect, and actually just the traditions that are associated with that and the intimacy that we have with bodies at the point of death or in the immediate days after. So I think that might start to inform things.
Got another question just to the...
Thanks everyone for sharing tonight. I have a question for Claire. You said that sad things seem worse when we seem to be suffering them alone, and that art helps people to realise that others experience suffering too. How have you found your art best assists people in moving out of this space of perceived suffering alone into a space of suffering together alongside others?
Well, and I was quoting at that point. So I think the notion of, I guess, cemeteries as an expression of collective grief, so me joining the dots between Armstrong and de Botton's assertion around the role of art and the notion of cemeteries, which are ultimately communal spaces by the sheer volume of people. So I think in terms of that notion of collective grief, I think it's implicit in cemeteries. I would say I don't have an art practice, but I do have a landscape architectural practice. I don't think that we have yet really evidenced anything that would actually do what I've just sort of asserted. I think that, in some ways, the Remembrance Drive project that I showed was an interesting example where, as a result of Vic Roads kind of planning the duplication of a freeway, it actually required or necessitated lifting a freeway interchange over the Remembrance Drive interchange, which was the Avenue of Honour. And so that came with lots of loaded complexity in relation to heritage constraints. But I think what was interesting for that project was that they had an obligation to do that, but they also needed to get support for that, and they needed to get good, strong community support. So I think that is an example where we were able to transform a freeway project into a place of collective remembrance, which has certain symbolism in that instance, where we were sort of working with the idea of the arch, the avenue, and the arc as three particular landscape typologies, but I guess also looked at it in terms of the idea of being in a hermetically sealed vehicle where you experience the freeway at speed, and there is a subtle audible difference in as soon as you go through the arc, down to the symbolism of the Flanders fields being referenced in Australian plants that flower red at the time around Anzac and Remembrance Day. and then the walls themselves, which supported lifting over the avenue, which I guess had hand-placed letters that we had worked with Michael Tuff, who's a historian who had researched all of the battles that people were involved in. So I suppose it wasn't an art proposition, but it was a design response and an engineering response that I think allowed people to have a place of remembrance and collective grief. And like I said, it was used to then leverage reuniting the avenue, which had lots of value for the community. So I'd say that's an example of how you can combine the sort of layers of complexity that we're all dealing with in contested space, a lack of budget, and the need for things to have multiple readings and multiple sort of value.
I'll just add that we've also kind of continued along those similar lines with the development of a new greenfield site just north of Fawkner Park, River Red Gum, characterised by very old, tall river red gum remnant species. And one of the components of that development is a massive memorial wall. So they're kind of a popular product where you place your cremated remains in a wall. It's another option, and covered by a plaque. But in this particular case, it was to be more conscientious about what kind of wall that we were trying to create, and so the location of the wall was quite strategic provided vantage points across the entire development, but used one of the remnant trees as the focal point to this memorial wall. So subsequently it became a half circle that embraced, metaphorically, I guess, and symbolically, this old river red gum tree. And because of its orientation in turn, brought in the wider landscape. So also performing the function of providing wall space for cremated remains, the actual design itself spoke more of the landscape and what an artistic gesture could do for that.
Perhaps got time for one more question. I can see two hands. Actually, sorry. Can I just direct the microphone down here? Thank you, first. And then we'll have another one at the back there.
Thank you. Look, I think we've heard some really interesting discussion tonight around the changing demand, around memorialisation, and that move away from some of the traditional ways and religious focus to more individual requirements. And in response to that, heard some really interesting ideas on new things that people are doing in the artistic world. My next question is therefore, what is being done to help that supply of new ideas and connect the artistic community with the memorial world to help fill that future demand as it changes?
Oh, that's a very good question. I thank COVID for that. In much the same way I thanked a 10-year drought for promoting the use of native and Indigenous plantings. Out of adversity comes, success in that respect. So it's early days yet, but I feel that we're in a time, and I think the panel has pretty much discussed that kind of transition from the old to the new. And I expect the so-called new normal, whatever that might be, will incorporate different kinds of attitudes towards death and mortality, in much the same way that people are thinking, well, working from home's not so bad after all, So it's getting over that initial fear, I think, and going beyond that sense of expectation, I think, and being bold and risk averse, I think. The new products are often sort of talked about in technological terms, and the world has no shortage of great ideas about memorialisation and interment through technical aspects. However, the demonstration and the practice is quite undercooked and underdone at the moment. So while everyone has great ideas, I think for people, particularly in Australia, that's my opinion, need to have something demonstrated before they'll embrace it and then run with it, finance it, fund it and go with it. So I think I'm very interested to know how this space will develop over the next 2 or 3, 4 years and beyond.
I'd also just mention there are a small but enthusiastic group of people taking studios at many universities on these topics, and great interest in all sorts of different landscape expressions, architectural expressions and products as well. So I think there's a lot of interest from an emerging generation of designers. And I think we've got the person with the orange scarf, I think. Perhaps our last question. Maybe it's red, looked orange.
Thank you. It is simultaneously orange and red. Hi, thanks for your insights tonight. Just wanted to ask, sort of building on your question just before, specifically in a Melbourne context, as an organisation, does GMCT look more towards transforming pre-existing cemeteries or developing new cemeteries across the metropolitan area? And how far do you think they would be prepared to innovate, look towards those really unusual future-focused models, understanding, of course, budget constraints and all that?
Well, it's how long's a piece of string? That's my. It's true. We're developing a new greenfield cemetery in Melbourne's west. And we're pushing for that to be a demonstration of what perhaps is possible. And quite frankly, we have no idea what that actually means. So we'll know it when we sort of start turning the soil over, really, I think, and probably won't really be convinced about what that is until 10 years after construction has taken place, and the attitudes and the favour, the demand, I guess, tells us otherwise. It's always been an intention of that particular development to reimagine what a cemetery could be. I think where it's located on the outskirts of Melbourne, on the urban growth boundary, in fact, in my mind, is doing what a rural cemetery from the 19th century once did, which was to provide relief from the heavily polluted cities, congested and crowded cities. We kind of understand urban sprawl and the plot ratio of people's backyards becoming smaller and smaller. And so their access to public open space is becoming, and nature for that matter, is becoming lesser and lesser. So a cemetery is a great vehicle to provide a public park, because it will never probably be built out, and at least probably 50% of the population don't want to live next door to a cemetery. We've had a developer tell us that, but that's another story. But regardless, I think, like their 19th century counterparts, the value and function of the cemetery will have to be multi-use and multifunctional now to provide for a whole lot of a swag of community benefits, and largely from a health and well-being aspect as well as events and walking trails and passive recreation, or possibly active for that matter. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see. We want to take those learnings from this particular project and see how we can make that replicable for other developments. And more importantly, as our existing cemeteries fill up, we'd like to know how we can perhaps retrofit some of the ideas into a space that's no longer generating an income, but is in fact costing us money to maintain. So we don't quite know how that's going to work, but we're certainly open to discussion and great ideas. So.
I think we will thank all of the audience for the questions and attention. I'd like to thank the panel members, Sam, Claire, Amy, and Hamish in particular, for pulling this whole event together. And I think it's been great just to hear the thinking and ideas, and it's always lovely to meet other people who are fascinated by cemeteries. So thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd just like to say too that it just wasn't me, but behind every great manager there's a great team, Katrina. So, and I've got one. So thank you.